Hi, this is Paul Ballard with Wintellect Dev Center, and I'm here today with Kathleen Dollard, 17-year MVP, and she's currently working on 3 open source projects with Roslyn.
Yeah.
So welcome.
Yeah.
So Kathleen, why should developers care about Roslyn?
Well, I think that there's 3 reasons that Roslyn is important to the average developer, and one of which is we get enhanced compilers. Just the fact we're getting new compilers is really important. If you can imagine compilers, and the 2012 and 2013 and back compilers were written starting in 1999. There wasn't an Agile manifesto. There wasn't our ideas about composition. There wasn't our ideas about unit testing. All of this stuff has been layered onto the compilers as they went along, and they were still in C++. So as the developers worked on the compilers that are our bread and butter, they weren't in our language. And so now the compilers have been rewritten in C# compilers, C#, Visual Basic compilers, and Visual Basic. And so now we have solid compilers on today's standard, and they've done a great job with it. Overall, I think the compatibility problems are going to be very minimal. So that's number one reason. The second reason is that it empowers a new level of action in Visual Studio. So Visual Studio went through some changes in 2010 to make it more composed and be able to tie in new extensions and that kind of thing way back then. But it kind of was pieced together as Microsoft was just starting to understand dependency injection. And now we've got this new way to talk between the compiler, and that's got the secrets. They know what a property is. They know what a parameter is. They know all these details at the parser of the compiler. And it's handing that stuff to Visual Studio, which will allow a fantastic new level of interaction inside Visual Studio. So that's the second reason. And the third reason is sort of esoteric, and it's the field I work in, and we're just kind of getting there in a lot of ways. And that's what it empowers in the big picture. So I work in metaprogramming. That's one part of the big picture. But once we give the world a way to see their code in an abstraction, who knows what they'll do with it? And this is why I'm so excited about the next 5 to 10 years, because we really are making the hard stuff, the parsing, the building of the trees, all this yucky stuff. We're giving that to people, and then they can take those abstractions and do something wonderful with it. And that's why I'm so excited about what we're going to see develop in the next 5 to 10 years. Microsoft does a lot to make some mainline scenarios easier working with Roslyn. I'm quite interested in the ones none of us have thought of yet. People in university, people out of university, people who have a fantasy about what they want for the future. They won't have to start parsing source code to get there, which made the bar too high. And now I think we're going to see some fantastic things coming down the pike.
So what are some of the new tools in Visual Studio that are powered by Roslyn?
Well, there's a couple of them. A couple that I particularly like are the new, there's a new breakpoint peak dialog that makes it easier to set breakpoints. That's a cool new little feature. When you hover, you'll see coloration now in the pop-up, that when you hover and you see what type it is and you see that pop-up information, it was really kind of gray unless you had some power tools or something installed. That stuff now is colored. It's very pretty, and you can read it so much easier. IntelliSense will be better. There's a lot of pieces that'll be better. The new refactorings are fantastic. First of all, they're in VB, which is very exciting in itself. And then in C#, they work so much better. You can do a rename, and if your rename conflicts, for instance, you have a field, the rename process will insert the word this where it's needed for the field. It's very sophisticated. And so that's all powered by Roslyn. And then we go even one step beyond that, because we've got this ability to write what's called an analyzer. And an analyzer in a high level you could think of as an FXCOP rule that a human being could actually write without first becoming an FXCOP expert, which is the bar we had before. There's people like John Robbins that wrote a lot of FXCOP rules. Thank you, that was fantastic, but they're hard. The new analyzers, you write them the way we think about code. They're not that hard to write. The first one might take a couple of days. If it's a hard one, it may still take that long. But people, once they get rolling with them, will be able to do things like ensure that if the block of an if is always got braces around it. That's a very easy analyzer to write. So if that's one of your rules, C# doesn't enforce it, but you enforce it. So we can effectively change the compilation process. We can make it more restrictive because that's what my organization wants or someone else's organization wants. And those will be widespread in the community, I think. I think that you'll be able to pick up a lot of analyzers and literally change the experience of writing code through analyzers. And they have fixes. So you'll be able to just do all that little, just fix it, and it'll happen for you. So that's a pretty exciting thing that's happening inside Visual Studio. Pretty stoked about that one.
What is metaprogramming?
Metaprogramming, well, I mentioned that before, and I should get back to explaining it, and different people have different definitions of it. So for me, what that means is code that changes the meaning of other code, that changes other code. And so for me, a lot of that's around code generation. I've experimented with a lot of different things, and I sort of fall back to that. So one of my projects is working at a better templating language than T4. So these are the kinds of things that I think about. But for neural people, those analyzers I just talked about, that's a way to do metaprogramming. It's a way to have code that changes and enhances other code. So we've got this even in the small right now. And I think that we're going to see an expansion of metaprogramming. Now, when they first started talking about Roslyn, myself and a lot of other people came, oh, goody, 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 we can do these really big metaprogramming things. And I think with great wisdom, some people, including Anders Hallsberg, said, no. They said, we need to build it and get the ground, we need to get the foundation right of a good compiler. And when we have a really good compiler, then we're going to be able to see where to go with metaprogramming. So we don't have any actual formal metaprogramming hooks in the current version of Roslyn, although myself and a lot of other people are doing things to work around that. And so I think the next wave, or the one after that, metaprogramming will be absolutely huge. And ultimately what that means is that you can write your code more simply. So the poster child is I notify property changed. And I notify property changed, what we all want to do is just write a bunch of auto properties, put notify property changed at the top of the class, and be done with it. And we can't do that today. So that's one of the things that we'd like to be able to do. Now, if that was if that was the only problem we had, there's a bunch of ways to solve it. But there's a lot more complex problems as we start down that route. Analyzers themselves could be written more easily through metaprogramming. And so as we go forward, I think we can see a lot of places where we're able to simplify our code. Now, another great thing about metaprogramming is that when I started way back when, decades ago, in metaprogramming, there were so many places that we needed to apply that simplification. And now if we look at things like the getter-only auto properties that we have in C# 6.0, the bar's coming down. There's less and less places that we have that icky, awful, complicated code that we have to write. So metaprogramming slowly, very slowly coming up, and we're having this great big decrease in where we have complexity. And we're going to take that part in the middle and be able to address that, I think, very soon.
So what are perf tips?
Perf tips. Oh, my favorite feature of the new version of Visual Studio. And the reason it's my favorite feature is that I think it kind of opens the door for a lot of programmers. So right now today, profiling is very hard. WintellectNOW has a great video that I recommend anybody who wants to learn about profiling. John Robbins' video is definitely the place to go on learning it. But if you don't already know profiling and all of a sudden you have a performance problem, it's like a 1,000-foot cliff. You're coming up and you know how to program and you thought you did a good job and you worked really hard and you don't even know if it's in your code. And you don't even know how to approach finding out if it's in your code. So there's this great big huge cliff. The reason I'm so excited about perf tips is they're a step up that ladder. Now they're a pretty small step initially. I'm excited to see what we might do in future releases. But all they are is the ability to, while you're debugging, between 2 points that you're stopping. So it could be single stepping if that's what you choose to do, or you could put a breakpoint and put another breakpoint and run everything in between there. And then as soon as you stop, without you doing a thing, it gives the time that you spent. So if you wanted to just go into a particular operation, put a breakpoint at the start and the stop, you run it, you get to the bottom, and printed right there is how much time it took. So you can very easily and very naturally find your big performance hits. Now, there's no route today from going from there to the kind of CPU and hit analysis that you need to do and that's provided by Visual Studio tools. So I talked to Dan Taylor this morning, he's on the team, and we're talking about how do we take people that are getting this first step and then they go, this is what I need next, and show them how to use tools that are already there and maybe improve those tools in a future version. So it's great because I think we're going to have profiling for the masses, if not this year, next year or the year after, and that's fantastic news because we all need to have applications that perform very well. And when we do that, we need to have confidence that we've done it right. And I really think tools are the right way to do that. So I'm just totally stoked about the perf tips. I think they're a great addition to Visual Studio.
So why should developers care about Microsoft moving to open source?
Oh, open source, wow. It's such a surprise. I mean, here we are, we had Microsoft, we thought we knew who Microsoft was. And 5 years ago, they were like this company and very closed. And I can remember 10 years ago when people were afraid to have beers with MVPs because they were afraid they might slip something and lose their job. It was horrible. And there's been a very long transition, and we're kind of moving across this, where Microsoft is open sourced a number of things. And I think one thing to realize is when we say open source, it's this huge spectrum. And when we look across that spectrum, Microsoft isn't all of a sudden going to take every pull request somebody sends to it. They're going to have a very tight reins on it. The bar is going to be exactly as high as it is for a Microsoft employee, which, by the way, is pretty darn high for getting stuff into the product. But they're doing this in different ways in different places, which is very exciting. So they have some things that are very complicated, and they're not open sourcing that right now. And they have things like Entity Framework, which has been open sourced for a while. And as they split what they're doing with that, they're going to have community involvement in that, which is all great. So the fact that the community is involved is good. And I don't want to limit that, but it's what everybody thinks about. I think what people don't think often enough about is that it makes the process transparent. And so if you go on Codeplex, you will find hundreds and hundreds of messages that you don't want to read, they're way too long, about some key features of C#6. So the way declaration expressions were pulled, but the way that string interpolation is actually going to work. There's hundreds of messages on that. So the community can say, this is how we think it should work. There's a major feature, null propagation or null conditionals or the Elvis operator, whatever you want to call that. That feature was actually fundamentally changed by community input, and it's right now, and it was wrong before, and I'm really proud that the community fixed it. And so we've got this fantastic opportunity to actually give them feedback early in the process, sometimes months after they very first start the process. So that is an absolutely fantastic side. And then we can do our own extensions. We can do all the open source stuff that's out there. We can hold them, they're more accountable. When they check in code, it's not just a few people on their team that's going to see it. So all these things I think come together to make a very vibrant, good thing. From Microsoft's perspective, I think the big thing they get is cross-platform. I think that you can't go cross-platform in today's world by yourself. To get there, Mono was always, an open source thing. In order to be live and real on other platforms, then they were going to have to be open source. So I think that's part of it. But I think at the end of the day, there's a bigger answer. And the biggest answer, the big answer to that is there's no choice. Microsoft and Microsoft tools will die if they don't go open source. And so they wouldn't die next year or the year after. But if you take the trajectory out on what open source can do and what Microsoft could do by itself, and who they can keep at the table, and the vibrancy they can keep, and how they can handle new devices, and how they can handle change, I don't think they could have done it. I think there really was no choice, and I have huge respect for the executives that had the courage to make those decisions and push Microsoft stepwise and sanely towards an open source world, which is just fantastically exciting.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us today, Kathleen.
Okay, it's great fun. Thanks, Paul.